sources of meaning become a lighthouse in the distance when someone maybe feels lost at sea in their grief, or they feel like they are drowning in their grief. Individuals who are touched by cancer also experience losses in terms of, we use grief to encompass the emotional reactions, the thought processes, the behaviors that are all part of that response to different kinds of losses.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet you again to a new edition of Beyond the Cancer Diagnosis Interview Series. Today is my pleasure to welcome Wendy Lichtenthal. She's a professor at the University of Miami at Sylvester Comprehensive Cancer Center, if I'm not mistaken. Wendy, thank you very much for accepting my invitation, and thank you for being with us today.
Of course, my pleasure. I'm so glad to be with you.
Today's topic will be around grief and loss, broadly speaking, like in general. And in our, let's say, field of expertise, which is psycho-oncology more or less, there are three, let's say, topics, subjects, ideas. I don't know how to name them. Grief, loss, bereavement, which, on my opinion, sometimes even us professionals, maybe or already we are using in the wrong context. So for the beginning, I will kindly ask you to define these three words or topics and to see where is the difference, where is that thin line that we are talking about loss and not grief, and when we are talking about bereavement and not loss. So to make a differentiation between.
Yeah. So I think we think about grief as the reaction, the response to loss. So that's one way to kind of differentiate it from the start. We use grief to encompass the emotional reactions, the thought processes, the behaviors that are all part of that response to different kinds of losses. And I think a lot of time people think about grief as a separation distress response. So when you are separated from someone or something that matters to you or to which you're attached or to whom you're attached. And so that separation often is in reference to a person. So often we talk about grief in response to a death loss. But certainly in the context of cancer, there are so many other kinds of losses that someone can experience. So they could experience the loss of a person or a separation from a person, but individuals who are touched by cancer also experience losses in terms of the patient themselves, maybe their physical functioning, parts of their body changes, the future that they imagined. All of these are losses that occur in the context of cancer. And so we can differentiate death loss from non-death loss. But grief is the response to those losses. Bereavement is often what most people are referencing with a death loss. But when we use the term loss or we use the term bereavement, we're actually not saying anything about how someone is responding. So it's with the grief or the ideas around grief and related reactions and responses that we are touching on. How did someone respond to this loss? The loss itself is maybe neutral in whether it is, it's objective. Something was lost, but it doesn't say anything about how someone responded. Same with bereavement. It's the event, and typically of a death loss, not really speaking to how someone responded. So those are, some ways to just kind of differentiate those terms.
Yeah, some ways, but very important ways, because one, it's a response to another, and for example, bereavement is just, let's say, a fact or like
the state. It is. Yeah. Someone is bereaved. They, again, in most cases, people are referencing a death loss. They experienced a death loss, but we don't know how they responded to it by virtue of saying they're bereaved.
And your field of expertise is with bereaved parents. Talking here about childhood cancer, pediatric cancer. And as we all know, the fundamental question in oncology, in psych-oncology, is why me? And during the interview with Dr. Alberto Costa, because I have to mention this, the CEO of European School of Oncology, he told me a very interesting thing, that you never can't be a good oncologist if you can't handle the question, why me? And I always said that this applies also to us, to psych-oncologists. If we can't handle this question, why me? Yes, we never achieve what we want to achieve. But in the case of bereaved parents, this question, why me, became why my child. From your expertise, how a professional can handle this why my child question?
Well, I think first, I think embedded in what you just said is normalizing this, right? The fact that when you have this unexpected experience, whether it's the diagnosis or the death of a child, again, for anyone touched by cancer, this why me? How did this happen? Is so natural, and so we want to normalize it by talking about the fact that we are driven to make meaning. That we have a natural drive as human beings for the world to be predictable and to make sense and to feel safe. We want to know that when we open the door, the floor is going to be below us and the sky is not going to fall on our head. And so this idea of when something shatters those kinds of beliefs about how the world operates, which the diagnosis of a child and certainly the death of a child often does, because it is not as expected. It is not what a parent assumes when they have a child. They don't assume that they will outlive their child. So now we have these challenged assumptions to reorganize and kind of feel that the world makes sense again. We are driven to answer this very question that you raised. Why? Why did this happen? Why my child, of all the children who are not touched by this illness? So again, just to summarize, the first response that we would have would be to normalize, to validate the drive to ask this question, to explain and provide some psychoeducation around meaning making and why it is something that individuals do, that we engage in this meaning making, because in order to put one foot in front of the other, we need the world to feel more predictable and safe, and to understand where there has been threat when something, like a loss or any kind of trauma or experience happens that is unexpected. We want to go back in time and understand, in some ways, because we want it to be preventable in the future, right? We have to, how did we get here? How did we get from A to Z? So a lot of that is figuring out causally what happened. What is my causal attribution? And unfortunately for parents, because of the innate drive to protect and preserve life, there is often a question of what was my role in this, right? So that why my child, how did this happen? It is not uncommon for parents to look toward their role as caregiver, as protector in this. And that becomes, of course, a challenge in working with parents is as they go through this sense-making process, giving space for questions and thoughts that are related to what was my role in this situation. Yeah.
You mentioned the theme, what was my role, yes, in all this process. And now I have to ask you this. What is the first emotion for a parent when hear the diagnosis? It's guilt, it's shame, it's fear, because you said about the role, and suddenly, in a blink of the eye, it's a new reality, yes? And what, from your experience, what is the first emotion that a parent experience? It's guilty or shame?
I think fear, tends to dominate so much of this. The fear is so present. I think we often say grief, just to bring it back to grief, begins at the time of diagnosis there, that the fear goes to a place of, for many, not everyone, but to a worst case scenario, and or a grief over the current losses, like what we expected for the next few months or the next year of our lives is now upended. So there's that piece of it, but I do think fear dominates. To speak to the guilt, though, and when that emerges, because of this meaning-making process, how did we get here? What happened here? It could be, but not always the case, that someone is wondering, first of all, if there were some symptoms presenting, could we have identified this sooner? And what was my role in that? Again, I always want to be careful with this, because our goal as psycho-oncologists is very much to help people cope with this and find a compassionate narrative in response to this. But I also want to normalize the fact that these kinds of thoughts go through people's minds, so that we as psycho-oncologists can help individuals understand most everybody does this. They go back and wonder, what could I have done? What did we do? Is there something that could have prevented this? Because we want to prevent it, because it is a protest reaction. So that's another thing about grief. When we think about what is grief, in many ways, part of grief is protest. How do I wish this wasn't so. And when we go back to that drive to figure out, how could I have made this not so, it is not uncommon for people to look at their what role they could have played in this. So we want to normalize that process, because that just because someone's engaging in that process and going to those places doesn't mean it's true that they are culpable, that they are truly guilty, that they did something wrong. So if we give people that psychoeducation to say, this is what our brains do. It's not, in fact, that you did something wrong here, or you were a bad parent, or for the patient themselves who says, I should have done this or that. And instead we say, what's happening for you right now is that drive to make sense of this absolutely unexpected, very threatening, scary situation. That's why your mind is doing that, not because it's a fact that you did something wrong. And that's sometimes an important piece of psychoeducation. And we can help people understand that when those thoughts go through their mind, to allow them, to permit them, to not pathologize them, because that's what most brains do. It's not pathological to think, how did we get here? And it's not uncommon for parents to explore, what was my piece in this, as they try to work that out.
We don't, let's say it's useless to think in the past. We just have to think further, move forward in a way. And in this sense, you've developed what is called meaning-centered grief therapy. Yes, to help parents experience, let's say, the grief or these feelings in a, put it like this, in a more organized way. Could you please develop what is meaning-centered grief therapy about, like number of sessions, the vision, the values you took into consideration when you developed this? I know that is coming from Professor Breitbart's meaning-centered psychotherapy, and I'm very interested what are the, let's say, the nuances that you've introduced.
Yeah. So one first response I'll have is that the major goal is to help individuals learn to coexist with their grief. So we acknowledge that the grief over that has to do with the loss, a death loss, a relationship, and specifically our work has focused as a start very much on parents who have lost a child, that this grief, there's no vision that the grief goes away, that grief ends. Grief is about a relationship, and that relationship continues. So really this meaning-centered approach is designed to help people learn to coexist with that grief that sometimes is more in the foreground and sometimes perhaps is less so, but a grieving parent, many grieving parents would say, is very much always present and felt. So there are 16 sessions that we've developed as part of this protocol, this intervention approach. The original meaning-centered psychotherapy that was developed by Dr. Breitbart and colleagues was 7 sessions in an individual format, 8 sessions as a group. But this is more expansive because we're not only tapping into the kinds of meaning in life. How do we find meaning in life in the face of a cancer diagnosis, which was the original meaning-centered approach? It's not just about how do I find meaning in life after a loss, but it's also attending to what we were talking about moments ago, which is the meaning-making process. This how do I understand and construct a reality after going through this loss, the illness experience and this loss experience. So there are 4 main principles or ideas that are woven into each of the 16 sessions. The first is this notion that is very much present in the original meaning-centered psychotherapy, which is that in the face of out-of-control situations, in the face of suffering, when we feel like we are trapped in our circumstances and our freedom has been taken from us, the last vestige of human freedom and the thing that we always have control over is our ability to choose our attitude, that is our response to our suffering, to our predicament. We use attitude here. A lot of this is language that was derived by Viktor Frankl, who wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And that word attitude is often used as a way of describing that response. But it is very, very important when we're talking about anything meaning-centered, particularly in the context of cancer and grief and loss, to be sure that individuals understand this is not about a prescription to find a positive attitude. So often attitude in the oncology world is very much loaded as something positive and it can be even prescriptive. And that is not what we're doing with the meaning-centered approach. It is much more about free will and choice. So this idea that we are free to choose our response, while we can't choose what happened to us, we can control how we respond. And so part of meaning-centered grief therapy is giving individuals a platform, a place to look at how they want to respond to what has happened, who they want to be in the face of this, what their stance is. So all of those ideas, response, stance, perspective, behaviors, can fall under the umbrella of attitude as we mean it in this context. So that's the first idea, is that we can't control what happens to us, but we can control our response and give individuals a platform to think about this, think about how they want to respond. The second major idea also is part of the original meaning-centered approach, which talks about how do we have a sense of meaning in life? Well, we need to connect to sources of meaning in our lives, to feel connected to those things that matter to us. So sources of meaning can just be defined as those things that are valued, that matter, that give us a sense of meaning. And often a loss experience can really leave someone feeling disconnected from those things that previously mattered to them. So the second core idea is that we are going to help individuals connect to sources of meaning in their lives and really use them as lighthouses. We could think of that metaphor as these sources of meaning become a lighthouse in the distance when someone maybe feels lost at sea in their grief, or they feel like they are drowning in their grief. Those lighthouses, those things that matter to them, become what they steer their ship toward. Many people may be familiar with the Nietzsche quote, "He who has a why to live for can bear with almost any how." And this is a core idea that we build into meaning-centered psychotherapy, the original. And it is very much part of what we do in meaning-centered grief therapy, where we're helping the griever kind of go on a journey and think about, what are my whys? And to help them, if they've become disconnected from those whys, feel like they can reconnect to them. Or, as often happens when you experience a profound loss, your priorities and what matters shifts. So perhaps part of the journey is helping someone connect to new sources of meaning, things that newly matter to them. So that is the second core idea of what we're doing. We're helping individuals connect to their whys, because when you are connected to your whys, it can help you endure the worst of circumstances, including your grief. The third idea has to do with how we construct meaning. And this goes back to what we were talking about before, is the why. How did we get here? How did this happen? And so it builds on this idea that we as human beings have the ability to construct meaning. It's a constructivist lens. We make it up. We decide. We are the narrators. We are the authors. And so we give space for the grieving individual to think about how they've been making meaning, and to really highlight this capacity to reconstruct meaning, that we can actually change the way we make meaning of things. We want to really build up someone's ability to do that. So back to the topic we were discussing before, if someone is saying, this is all my fault that this happened, I should have done this and I didn't do it like that, and they're omitting other details of perhaps everything they did do, all the efforts they made. For example, if we're talking about a child getting diagnosed, well, I did this and this and this and this, but it wasn't fast enough to catch this diagnosis early. But the way they narrate it at this moment is only pointing to what they didn't do and not what they did do. What we're going to highlight is their capacity to change the meaning, change how they tell the story. So we do this. We construct meaning of events. We construct meaning of experiences. Very importantly, in grief, we also construct meaning of our emotional reactions. So we also are going to highlight for an individual how they're making meaning even of their grief experience, because we know that, grief is excruciating. It's so painful. And if someone starts to experience that grief and the meaning they make of the grief itself is that it's dangerous, or I can't bear it, I can't handle it, that can lead to lots of challenges. Among them is disconnection from things that are meaningful to them. It could lead to disconnection from their connection to the person who died, their child, if it's a grieving parent, because they're so afraid of the pain. So we also do a lot of work on how you can construct different meanings of even your grief response. But the major point there is that ultimately we are the authors, we are the narrators, we are the ones who infuse meaning into anything that we experience. And we're going to help individuals both recognize how they're doing that, but also give them a space to think about perhaps reconstructing meaning when it's not a helpful meaning that they've landed on, that we can continue to reconstruct and revise that meaning. So the person becomes the author of their narrative, of their life story, but they also in many ways become the narrator for the person who died. And so for parents, this is in some ways how they narrate their child's life. And that leads us to the fourth core idea for meaning-centered grief therapy, which is that relationship with the person who died, be it a child, a spouse, a parent, that relationship can continue and can continue to be a source of meaning, something that the same way you nurture a relationship that where someone is physically present, you can continue to have that relationship. And so we provide a lot of scaffolding for that source of meaning to continue to be present in the griever's life as well. So those 4 ideas are woven throughout those 16 sessions, and the 16 sessions have specific topics, and it just gives us a way to organize and think about all of these different ways that meaning could be affected systematically. It's not the only way to explore meaning in the face of loss, but it is at least one way to do it.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive and very interesting develop and explanation of what meaning-centered grief therapy is, and what the most important, what you intend to do further.
Yeah.
Since we are approaching to the end of our interview, I had some other questions prepared, but I want to ask you one question that I have to admit it that I also address to a palliative childhood cancer specialist, and you mentioned about meaning of life. Yes, you mentioned about Viktor Frankl, and we all know that Viktor Frankl talked also about legacy. Yes, meaning the legacy that we leave behind. And what I want to ask you, because you work with bereaved parents, yes, with a child who it's about the legacy. And I asked that palliative specialist that a child, for example, a newborn or a child till 6 years, can't let a legacy behind. And she told me yes. I want to ask you the same question because there is a very interesting quote that says that legacy is not something that you leave for people, it's something that you leave in people.
Yes.
In the case of parents and their child who passed away, what is the legacy in your view as a specialist?
Yeah, this idea that legacy is within is so important. For parents and children, those legacies are completely intertwined. The parent has given to the child, has shaped them, has influenced, has fed them, has nurtured them, and that they are witness to their legacy being infused in that child for as long as that their child is physically present with them. But no doubt that child is influencing the parent among many others whose lives are touched. And so it is very much within the individual who has been touched by that child. And again, if we're talking about parents, we are often working with parents to help them tap into the ever-present legacy, living legacy. We use that terminology, living legacy. That legacy continues to have a ripple effect within the parent. And as that parent continues on in the world, whether it's sharing their child's story to someone else, that legacy is living because it is continuing to have a ripple effect. It's now impacting the next person who heard about their child. And that goes within, right? That it's often inspiring. It's often leaves someone feeling like if that child faced what they could face, perhaps I can face what I am, whatever is before me. It can, so it is within. It is not an often an external gift, as we sometimes people think of legacy, but it is very much feeling changed by having known and encountered this person, no matter how long their lives were. So certainly, I think if that's kind of taps into what you're speaking of, the parent influences the child, and the child absolutely shapes the parent. And even after that child has died, the parent, as they continue to affect the world, they're taking their child with them, and that ripple effect only grows.
Very interesting and hopeful way to end our interview. This idea that the relation between parents and child will never end.
Okay.
And in Eastern Europe, we all the time say that children are the most important project for every parent. So indeed, and in terms of relations, it's very interesting that this will continue.
Yeah,
forever.
I think just to say that because that is often such a central source of meaning for a parent, the challenge of feeling like a loss of their sense of meaning is shaken by the fact that their child is no longer physically present. What you're speaking to right now is that they can still derive a sense of meaning by continuing to stay connected to their child, and for many, taking whatever has touched them and continuing that on in the world. They are still a parent to that child, even though the child is not physically here. We really want to emphasize that point.
Great. Wendy, thank you very much. It was quite an insightful interview, for sure, for our audience, very emotional, because majority of us, we are parents, so we can feel what, for sure, they will feel what we've discussed today.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this information, for being part of this interview series, and good luck in your activity further.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving space for this topic. It is often not spoken about, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to OncoDaily on YouTube. Hit the bell icon to stay updated.